Yeah, okay. I hang out, as Sanchit was saying, in the 19th century. So for someone like me, it's really exciting to be introducing uh, Matthew Beaumont and his constellation of interests. Matthew is a professor of English literature at University College London. He completed his DPhil and I think also master's and undergrad from Oxford, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and also taught there. And at UCL, he runs the UCL Urban Lab. He co-directs it and oversees the Cities Imaginaries strain of research. One of the things I've been noticing in today's talks is that along with doors and hallways, there's been a certain amount of discussion, glancing and offhand sometimes, of walking. And these peripatetic inclinations are very much in keeping with Matthew's work. He's written books like The Walker on finding and losing oneself in the modern city, which thinks about the fact that there's no such things as, there's nothing like lost steps and sort of traces the footsteps of various rich and aimless wanderers down the pages of 19th and 20th century texts. He's also written Nightwalking, a nocturnal history of London. He's co-authored and written and co-edited many other works dealing with literary criticism, theory, utopias, insomnia, a range of things like the fin de siècle. And apart from that, he's also edited and introduced some of the definitive Oxford World's Classics editions of some of our favorite works. So H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, Walter Pater's Studies in the History of the Renaissance, among others. Given that this is a conference devoted to the Writer-Critic, it comes as no surprise that he's also been writing short stories and has written a novel. And not many people know this, but he's also written a rock musical about the critic Harold Bloom, which is called Bloom Harold. And it is going to be opening in the West End. And I'm hoping that he will maybe hum a line or two from that before he begins. Yes. You got us. It's the 1st of April, yes. Anyway, he's going to be speaking to us about learning and unlearning, I think refracted through an exemplary and beautiful figure, from what I understand. Over to you. Take it away. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Mandakini, very much indeed. And as Amit recognized all too quickly, it's April the 1st, and I have not written a rock musical based on the life of Harold Bloom, I'm afraid. My son did an April Fool on me earlier. In fact, I had to run out of one of the sessions because he said that his younger brother had got his girlfriend pregnant. And so I shot out in panic, anyway, he got me. Right. So yes, this is going to be, I'm going to start with an epigraph from Roland Barthes, to whom I will return. As Lisa said when I admitted in the round table yesterday that this was going to be in part about Barthes, given that there was discussion at the round table of Barthes, Lisa said that I'd been scooped. And I have been scooped slightly. I hope what I have to say won't sound repetitive as a result. So I start with an epigraph from Barthes, from Camera Lucida, his last book, published in 1980, posthumously, just after he died. And he refers there to a discomfort I had always suffered from, the uneasiness of being a subject torn between two languages, one expressive, the other critical. Okay, that's the epigraph, the title, In Praise of Unlearning. The title alludes to a rhetorical tradition that was popular with humanist thinkers in 16th and 17th century Europe, and that is the laudatio, a term derived from the Latin verb laudare, to praise, denoting an act of praise or commendation. The Latin noun laus, signifying fame or praise, is apparently cognate with the Old English leuth, which refers to a song, a poem, or hymn. So at this etymological level, we're perhaps already occupying a rhetorical space in which there's little distinction between what today we might describe as non-fictional prose on the one hand and poetry on the other, between the tasks of the critic and the writer. Specifically, my title echoes the type of discourse known by the phrase in laudem doctrinae, in praise of learning. Now, this early modern tradition recalled classical precedents, such as a passage from the end of Book 1 of Cicero's De Legibus, written in the mid-1st century BCE. Cicero's Laudatio Sapientiae, or speech in praise of wisdom, claims that self-knowledge is the most difficult part of wisdom. Erasmus's In Praise of Folly from 1511 is a satirical contribution to this tradition. It's a kind of appropriation of that tradition in satirical spirit, initiated by Cicero and others in the classical period and picked up by various early modern writers. More importantly, for my purposes, an early speech by Francis Bacon in praise of knowledge from 1592, which comprises a panegyric to learning, is a much less playful contribution than Erasmus's to this tradition that I'm invoking. So, in fact, in a far more qualified sense, is his book of the proficience and advancement of learning, divine and human, slightly later from 1605, which exhorts James I to promote learning and defends the place of learning in politics. By thus invoking Bacon in the present context, I'm no doubt immediately embroiling us in the politics of learning, not least because he is, of course, popularly associated with the formula, knowledge is power. Now, in fact, we will get through all these Latin phrases and etymologies, I promise you. In fact, this phrase, scientia potentia est, first appears as such not in Bacon, but in Hobbes, who included it in the revised Latin edition of Leviathan in 1668. It's not, then, a Baconian axiom. Bacon uses the phrase ipsa scientia potestas est in his Meditationes Sacrae from 1597, but there he's not equating knowledge and power in some uncomplicated sense, in the sense that we're used to thinking he does, so much as criticizing those heretics who fail to grasp that God's knowledge is an effect of his power. Indeed, in both In Praise of Knowledge and The Advancement of Learning, he identifies knowledge with pleasure rather than power. In the former, he asks, is not knowledge a true and only natural pleasure, whereof there is no satiety? And in the latter, he insists that all knowledge and wonder, which is the seed of knowledge, is an impression of pleasure in itself. Now, that's rather a different impression of Baconian principles to the one given by a book such as Knowledge Power, Interdisciplinary Education for a Complex World from 2010 by the social scientist Alan Wilson, who is, I discover, a colleague of mine at UCL. I'm now going to stick the boot in, I'm afraid. Formerly Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leeds, currently the chair of the Home Office Science Advisory Committee. He was Director General for Higher Education at the Department for Education and Skills during Tony Blair's tenure as Prime Minister in Britain. Wilson's book's epigraph, allegedly taken from Bacon, is knowledge is power. And it underpins his assumption both that knowledge, and I'm quoting here, knowledge is now the key capital resource, and that, again I'm quoting, universities are seen as economic instruments. That's something he approves of. Knowledge, he argues in his first chapter, is the crucial social resource. And I quote, it empowers people in a knowledge-based economy. It is what underpins any kind of critical thinking. It is civilizing, he italicizes that word, oddly. In a phrase, what counts, he says, is knowledge power. There's no mention of pleasure in knowledge, in relation to knowledge, in Wilson's book, and nor, incidentally, is there any sense that that word that he italicizes, civilizing, might be problematic in relation to knowledge and power and their relationship to one another. Indeed, Wilson's book is utterly joyless, even when, in a familiar dialectic, it ties knowledge as a social and financial resource to knowledge as an individual and moral one. And I quote again, education, he says, has always been instrumental in two dimensions, for the economy, but also for the liberal personal development, which is the basis of a civilized society. So once again, he's using very critically and self-reflexively that word civilized. It's probably no accident that Wilson's book was published the year that in Britain, the ruling coalition of Conservatives and Liberal Democrats raised the cap on university fees to £9,000 a year, a policy that formalised and rapidly accelerated the marketisation of higher education in the UK. Learning in Wilson's book is lifelong learning, as he calls it, a process that he somehow manages to make sound exhausting rather than inspiring, as it should be. In this paradigm of his, learning is instrumentalised in a pseudo-Baconian rather than Baconian fashion, as the fact that he gets the quotation wrong and ascribes knowledge is power to Bacon indicates. I far prefer Bacon's non-apocryphal axiom that learning is a pleasure whereof there is no satiety. There's no satisfaction. Stefan Collini has recently pointed out that the paradox of real learning is that you don't get what you want and you certainly can't buy it. Now, predictably, as someone who teaches in the humanities department, I favour this premise, which is, in effect, as I see it, an anti-capitalist one. Not that I'd make any huge claims for sitting and reading and writing books in a political sense. Satisfaction is not possible, and it's precisely this, paradoxically, that makes it so satisfying. As Bacon puts it in The Advancement of Learning, of knowledge there is no satiety, again, but satisfaction and appetite are perpetually unchangeable. We currently inhabit a situation, as Collini subsequently remarks, where the true use value, as he puts it, of scholarly labour can be seen to have somehow been squeezed out. Only the exchange value of the commodities produced, as measured by the metrics, remains. So taking pleasure in the thing itself has been marginalised completely in favour of the exchange value of learning. The most obvious example or symptom of this in the UK is the idea of impact, which we've touched on before now, yesterday I think. Impact as a means of measuring the utility and potential profitability of a piece of scholarship. The UK research councils define impact as the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. This contribution is itself defined in their terms as fostering global economic performance, and specifically the economic competitiveness of the United Kingdom, increasing the effectiveness of public services and policy, and enhancing quality of life, health, and creative output. So here's a classic instance, if I can put it like this, of the humanities imprinting, as the psychologists might put it, on the sciences, and in so doing, internalizing the free market principles that currently shape the production of science. The word impact, as the emphasis on economics in these statements from the research councils is enough to indicate, is code for exchange value. So how might we try to restore use value, not simply to scholarly labour, to use that phrase again, but to all the intellectual activities that in a knowledge economy, again Wilson's phrase, that is systematically annexing research to the private sector, still fall within the orbit of universities and the public sector. When learning is as commodified as it has become in the 21st century, how can we resist what Marina Warner explaining why she relinquished her academic post at the University of Essex. She's an absolutely exemplary writer-critic. What she has called the general distortions required to turn a university into a for-profit business, one advantageous for administrators, she means managers really, and punitive to teachers and scholars. Warner subsequently became Professor of English and Creative Writing at Birkbeck College, the UK's preeminent institution of lifelong learning. At present, no less than half of the staff in the English department at Birkbeck, where she was based, have been threatened with redundancy. The most practically effective answers to the fundamental questions I've raised about the role of use value in higher education can, in my view, be located in the industrial action, like the strikes that have been taking place in universities in the UK over the last 5 or 6 weeks. This industrial action is not only, or even principally, about pensions, salaries, and the sorts of racial and gendered inequalities that structure the teaching profession at university level, though those are its proximate causes. It's about the future of higher education. In that sense, I think the most significant demand of those like me who are striking is for an end to the increasing casualization of teaching, because in addition to casualizing learning, this is actively creating the preconditions for the privatization of universities. The UK government shifting resources to the most selective universities while exposing the majority of higher education institutions to new commercial pressures is explicitly committed to deregulating the sector and opening it up to private companies. It's in response to these questions about the future of the humanities, against that rather grim background, one populated with so-called learning events, that I speak in praise of unlearning. It's my presumption, my modest proposal, as it were, that universities and other institutes of learning should also be sites of unlearning. What do I mean by unlearning? As I understand it, unlearning does not simply entail consciously questioning assumptions or attitudes that for pernicious ideological reasons tend to remain unquestioned. It doesn't just mean dismantling the mentalities that produced, for example, racism and sexism, urgent and important though that task undoubtedly is. Instead, it entails undoing and democratizing the discourses that sustain universities and other institutes of learning. It seeks to transform learning into a process that challenges the regimes of knowledge. Raymond Williams, and Lisa, I think, mentioned Raymond Williams very briefly. We should remember that he was a novelist as well as a critic, a formidable critic, although we don't naturally think of him as a writer-critic. Perhaps we should do so more. Raymond Williams provides a suggestive starting point when he talks of the pressing need to unlearn at the price of survival, as the price of survival, the inherent dominative mode. Williams includes this exhortation in the Conclusion to Culture and Society from 1958, in the final polemical section on the development of a common culture. In the sentences prior to this point about the need to unlearn, he provides a sense of what he means by the dominative mode, a sense that's resonant today, I think, in part because of his stress there on the destruction of the environment, extremely foresightful, as he was in so many ways. As Williams explains, he sees the dominative mode as one of the mainsprings of industry, the theory and practice of man's mastering and controlling his natural environment. And the important task, he implies, as we learn the folly of exploiting any part of this environment in isolation, is to attend to our environment as a whole. I mean, he means our environment in a very broad sense, but he's certainly also talking about it in its ecological inflection. The same applies to humanity as far as he's concerned, for where the dominative mood, in fact, he says there, interestingly, so there's a slippage from mode to mood, or what he might later describe as a structure of feeling, where the dominative mood extends to man himself, where human beings are also isolated and exploited with whatever temporary success. The issue in the long run, he says, is a cancelling in spirit of the full opportunities offered by the material gains. Learning the dialectic of material gain and spiritual loss, for him implicitly is a kind of unlearning. We must learn in order to unlearn. We must unlearn in order to learn. The dominative mode, so Williams intimates in his characteristically demanding and sometimes really rather opaque prose, constitutes, among other things, what he calls a refusal to accept the creative capacities of life, a determination to limit and restrict the channels of growth. Unlearning, as I conceive it, affirms those creative capacities of life, and it opens the channels of growth that are suppressed by the commodification, by the commoditized forms of learning that are paradigmatic today in higher education. It's a mode of thinking and writing, and its privileged agent, I propose, is the writer-critic rather than the professional scholar. The writer-critic in that deprofessionalized sense that Amit has drawn our attention to over the years, in fact. Unlearning is a matter of form rather than content, and its privileged medium in that sense, I propose, is the essay rather than the article. And there's been a certain amount of talk about essays over the last couple of days. It was Bacon, of course, the first edition of whose essays was published in 1597, who was the great progenitor of the essay form in England. The writer-critic in the essay cultivates what Keats famously called negative capability, I think, a phrase that captures for preliminary purposes what I mean by unlearning. That is, and I'm quoting here Keats's famous letter from 1817 or whenever it was, that is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So the essay is a lesson in that sort of unlesson, the kind of unlesson that's evoked by the notion of negative capability in Keats. Now, the writer and critic on whom I want to concentrate, as I've implied, as exemplary in relation to unlearning is Roland Barthes. It's completely misleading to designate him, as for decades was done in English, a theorist, I think, and thinking of him as a writer-critic is a much more helpful way of looking at him and classifying him. I'm thinking especially of Barthes in the final half-decade of his life, when he was detaching himself from what he called the euphoric dream of scientificity, the euphoric dream of scientificity. I love that phrase. More specifically still, Barthes in the last 2 or 3 years, the 2 or 3 years between taking up his post in the chair, as a chair in sémiologie littéraire at the Collège de France, which Martin mentioned, in January 1977, and his death, his premature death in March 1980. The Collège, an institution in which teaching and research are very closely linked, doesn't, as some of you might know, doesn't grant degrees, and that partially protects it from the market forces reshaping higher education in Europe. The role of a professor there, as Barthes pointed out, poetically enough, is to speak, I shall even say, to dream his research aloud, not to judge, not to give preference, to promote, to submit a controlled scholarship. So I'm focusing on the late Barthes then, and hence probably presupposing certain ideas about late style that have become indelibly associated with that adjective late in this sort of context. But my comments on him as a champion of unlearning, from whom in the present conjuncture we can still learn an enormous amount, broadly apply, I think, to his entire intellectual career. As he said at the start of his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, despite having long hoped to inscribe his work within the field of science, think of all those early structuralist essays, I must admit that I've produced only essays, an ambiguous genre, he says, in which analysis vies with writing. An ambiguous genre in which analysis vies with writing. Another wonderful phrase, I think. It's in fact precisely because in the essay writing and analysis vie with one another in an ambiguous or ambivalent space that I'm interested in it here today, as it were. Barthes' inaugural lecture, entitled Leçons, in what I take to be a deliberate irony when it was published in book form in 1978, or in journal form in 1978, because it's very much not a lesson, it's a kind of anti-lesson, an unlesson, is a tribute to unlearning. But like his 3 courses at the college over the course of the next 3 years, it's also an exercise in unlearning, I think. Let me introduce the lecture and its theme of unlearning through an allusion to the 19th century French historian Jules Michelet, the subject of Barthes' second book, which appeared in 1954. In his opening remarks in the inaugural lecture, according to academic protocol, Barthes pays respect to his distinguished antecedents at the Collège de France, including Paul Valéry, Merleau-Ponty, Benveniste, and finally his sponsor in this very prestigious professorship, which was Michel Foucault. The first person he singles out, though, is the rather more remote figure of Michelet. First, of course, he says, comes Michelet, through whom, at the start of my intellectual life, I discovered the sovereign place of history in the study of man and the power of writing, once scholarship accepts that commitment. The power of writing, once scholarship accepts that commitment. It's no small thing, he's implying, perhaps. It requires a certain amount of courage for scholarship to respond to the power of writing, to its challenges, its invitations. Revealing the power of writing and compelling scholarship to accept that commitment is, in a sense, precisely the vocation, I would say, of the writer-critic. But before I look at Barthes' reflections on this vocation in the late 70s, I want to cite an anecdote about Michelet that isn't included in the inaugural lecture. In 1852, Michelet was dismissed from his professorship at the Collège de France after refusing to take an oath of allegiance to Emperor Napoleon III. In 1851, so the year before, he realized that the authorities had suspended his lectures for that same reason, so prior to getting rid of him altogether. But he was apparently consoled at this situation by the verdict of some of those who'd attended his lectures, some of his students. And I quote, "We learnt nothing from your lectures. It is simply that our soul, absent, came back to us." Now that, I propose, is the ideal response to a learning that's also an unlearning. In the inaugural lecture, Barthes' most pressing political point as a semiologist is that power is parasitic on the trans-social organism, as he calls it, that is language. In both its spoken and written forms, language, as he says, enters the service of power. Now, this is the occasion of Barthes' sensational and very controversial claim, which kicked up a stink at the time, that language, and I'm quoting here again, the performance of a language system is neither reactionary nor progressive, it is quite simply fascist. For fascism does not prevent speech, it compels speech. So language is fascist, that's how it was decontextualized, not doing too much injustice, it has to be said, to what Barthes himself had said. That's what can cause the controversy. To put it in the classic post-structuralist terms, rather, the subject does not speak language, language speaks the subject. We're spoken through, language speaks through us and constructs us in so doing. Signs, Barthes stresses, exist only insofar as they're recognizable and repeatable. They are, as he puts it, gregarious. And in each sign, he says, sleeps that monster, a stereotype. So language is gregarious. Signs are gregarious. And in each sign sleeps that monster, a stereotype. That monster's lethal force, we might say, is that it does our thinking for us. In speaking and writing, we constantly capitulate to stereotypes. We do so uncomfortably, but inevitably. I am not content to repeat what has been said, Barthes says, to settle comfortably in the servitude of signs. But then one has to some extent. To speak at all, one has to capitulate, one has to repeat, one has to make oneself comfortable with the servitude, in the servitude of signs. And in thereby capitulating to the standardized ideas or preconceptions that loiter, in his lovely phrase, in speech, that loiter, as it were, like police officers patrolling their beat with a slightly aggressive intent, I suspect. We submit to language as a crypto-fascist force that compels intellectual and ideological conformity. That's basically Barthes's argument as I read him. Our failure is to form habits, as Walter Pater, who as Mandakini has said, I edited some of. Our failure is to form habits, as Walter Pater remarked half a century and a half ago, for after all, habit is relative to a stereotyped world. So for Pater too, there was an enormous danger in stereotypes and in habits, in all of those activities, including linguistic ones that do our thinking for us, that suspend our capacity for critical reflection on the world we inhabit. The linguistic habits that are inscribed not simply in the content of speech, but its form, through grammar, for example, and through the kinds of discursive conventions that we employ in all sorts of different contexts, at once produce and reproduce this stereotyped world of which Pater, who in many respects I think is a kind of precursor, in fact, to Barthes, speaks. If signs are gregarious in Barthes' language, from the Latin gregarius, meaning a flock of sheep, of goats, then it's the task of the writer-critic, Barthes effectively arguing, I think, to use them egregiously, from the phrase ex, Latin ex gregarius, from outside the flock. To be egregious is to stand outside the flock. And he, I think, is urging us to use signs egregiously. If human language has no exterior, in Barthes' phrase, and we are thus condemned ceaselessly to perform or recapitulate our servitude to that stereotyped world of Pater's, then the only remaining alternative is, this is Barthes again, to cheat with speech, to cheat speech. How do we cheat with speech? How do we cheat speech? His answer in a single word is literature. By literature, of course, he means the practice of writing. He doesn't mean an inert body of text, a tradition. He means the practice of writing, the creation of a fabric of signifiers, as he puts it. Now here is Barthes' utopian politics of language. And like other utopias of language from that time, it's a symptomatic response, I think, to the defeat of the revolutionary hopes of 68. This salutary trickery, Barthes says, this evasion, this grand imposture, which allows us to understand language outside the bounds of power, in the splendor of a permanent revolution of language, I, for one, call literature. So he's using the same kind of political language that the Soissons-Huitals used, but displacing it into a linguistic context. Literature, for Barthes, is egregious in that etymological sense of flagrantly standing outside the flock, of standing out from the flock. It stages language in order playfully and self-consciously to expose the sign's sheep-like susceptibility to the stereotypical. Unlearning, then, is learning that deploys the resources of literature. It's learning that involves writing, which Barthes claims is to be found wherever words have flavour. The French word for flavour, the French words, he says, for flavour and knowledge have the same root. The word savour might have been the better as well as the more literal translation there, I think, since it makes the etymological connection clearer. Where knowledge is concerned, Barthes goes on, things must have that ingredient, the salt of words. It is this taste of words, he goes on to say, which makes language profound, fecund. And in fact, he illustrates this point briefly by gesturing to Michelet, who proposes, he says, much that is denied by historical scholarship, but whose importance resides in the fact that he displaces knowledge into writing. Unlearning of the sort prized by Michelet's students uses words not as simple instruments. Instead, it casts them, Barthes says, as projections, explosions, vibrations, devices, flavors. So this kind of language, it vibrates in the ear, it explodes in the mouth, it's salty, it's tasty, it's to be savoured. Recall Bacon's precept that knowledge should be a true and only natural pleasure, whereof there is no satiety. The semiology that Barthes outlines in his inaugural lecture is one that denies that it is possible, as he says, to attribute to the sign traits that are positive, fixed, ahistoric, acorporeal, in short, scientific. And the unlearning that I'm outlining here, if only in very faint terms, is predicated on the same assumption. It affirms language that is, on the contrary, unfixed, historic, corporeal, and that refuses a scientific paradigm for knowledge, as indeed for the impact of that knowledge. But can, in this respect, help us, I think, to focus on the form as opposed to the content of knowledge. For what can be oppressive in our teaching, he says, is not finally the knowledge or the culture it conveys, but the discursive forms through which we propose them. No doubt speaking from a podium in this monologic way is one of those forms, it should be said. Barthes suggests that in attempting to loosen or trouble power, the power both in language in general and in scientific language specifically, it's imperative to employ the rhetorical techniques of fragmentation when writing and digression when teaching. Now, it's in the final 4 or 5 sentences of this first professorial lecture at the Collège de France that Barthes himself uses the term unlearning. It's the only place I think that he does use the term, although I may be wrong. And I will quote from them in full. Citing Michelet as his antecedent one more time, he announces that that Barthes himself is entering a vita nova, marked today by this new place, this new hospitality, the collège. And he concludes, I undertake, therefore, to let myself be borne on by the force of any living life, forgetfulness. There is an age at which we teach what we know. Then comes another age at which we teach what we do not know. This is called research. Now, perhaps, he says, comes the age of another experience, that of unlearning, of yielding to the unforeseeable change which forgetting imposes on the sedimentation of the knowledges, cultures, and beliefs we have traversed. This experience, he says, has, I believe, an illustrious and outdated name, which I now simply venture to appropriate at the very crossroads of its etymology. There's a little pun there, typical of him. Here's a digression, which is that he's picking up on the Greek word, the word for a crossroads, trivia, which is the place where 3 roads met, Greek and the Latin terms. And so he's bringing us into the everyday, in other words. So at the very crossroads of its etymology, this word, sapientia, that Baconian word, as it happens, no power, Barthes says, a little knowledge, a little wisdom, and as much flavour, savour, as possible. Unlearning, I think, is situated at the intersection, the crossroads, the trivial point of wisdom, knowledge, and above all, savour. That word sapientia, which he draws attention to, is derived from the Latin verb sapere, which means both to be wise or discerning and to taste or to have taste. Shaped by the contingencies of forgetting, unlearning refuses power, and combining wisdom, knowledge, and taste, it affirms pleasure. This pleasure is the pleasure of savouring. Savouring involves knowing and enjoying something in its unfixed, historic, corporeal state, something in a state of becoming or unbecoming. The essay, which is the privileged written medium of unlearning, as I've already suggested, or as I'm arguing, is the discursive form that offers, I think, the greatest opportunity for savouring, that is, for simultaneously knowing and tasting something. The essay, and of the sort that gets published in N+1, the essay is an occasion for testing certainly, as its etymological origins in the French noun essayer, related to the verb essayer, indicates, but it's also an occasion for tasting. It's where we both test and taste ideas, objects, texts. But I should stress that in this context, to taste is not the aristocratic activity that it once was in the 18th century, when the critic really emerges in their modern historical form, and where they were in journals like The Spectator exercising taste. Potentially, at least, it's a democratic activity, it seems to me. Now, I'm not going to reconstruct the evolution of the essay form here, needless to say, and you'll be relieved to hear. But I take it as axiomatic that historically the essay is the site of provisional experimental thinking, as its etymology might suggest. Perhaps I can make the point briefly by returning to the late 16th century and quoting its pioneering French exponent, so Bacon's sort of other half, if you like, Montaigne, who writes in On Repenting from 1588 that in taking himself as his subject, he is not portraying being but becoming, and it might be added unbecoming. Every theorist of the essay form since that time, when neither Montaigne nor Bacon thought it necessary to define it as such, is indebted, I think, to that Heraclitean position, that emphasis on becoming and unbecoming. Georgi Lukács, for example, insists that the essay is a judgment, but the essential, the value-determining thing about it is not the verdict, as is the case with the system, but the process of judging. What matters is not the relative tastefulness ascribed to the essay's object, its place in a particular cultural hierarchy, but the process of tasting it. The essay in that respect is the repository of use value as opposed to exchange value. In conclusion then, and foreshortening the discussion, it might be useful to compare and back with etymologies, I'm afraid, the etymologies of the essay and the article. The word essay, as we've already seen in the first edition of it offered by the OED, means a trial, a testing, a proof, an experiment. It's synonymous with the archaic word assay, to assay something. The first example in English, predictably, is taken from Bacon's Advancement of Learning. Sorry, I muddled my pages up. If we turn now to the older phrase assay, it becomes even clearer, I think. There's that same emphasis on trying something. And one of the obsolete meanings associated with that word, with assay, with the A form, dating from the late 15th century, is in fact the trial of anything by tasting. The word article is also, of course, derived from French precedents, but in contrast to the word essay, it points not to a process, but a particular moment in time, a particular thing. It denotes a portion of something, a separate portion. An article is something discrete, something distinct, something finished and itemized. We talk about the finished article. Hence, from the early 17th century, it means, among other things, a commodity, an item of goods or property. An article, in other words, is subject to the logic of metrics and of the marketplace. An essay isn't. It's not a finished article. It's an unfinished article, or it's not an article at all, an essay. An article is a repository of exchange value. An essay isn't, or it needn't be. The essay isn't about metrics, which always pertain to a system, but heuristics, to the business of discovering things, tasting, savouring, which are necessarily not systematic. It's speculative and imaginative, which is one of the reasons why I think it's appropriate. It's the appropriate form of the writer-critic. Moreover, it's a repository of pleasure, to use a term that's central to both Bacon and Barthes. In contrast to the article, the essay is the site of what the latter, Roland Barthes, thought of as writing for nothing, an activity that flatly contradicts the dominative mode. As Andy Stafford has remarked, the late Barthes effectively announced, I'm going to write for nothing in order to show that the pleasure it involves is not recuperable by an alienating society which reifies production. Discussing Proust in a lecture at the Collège de France in 1978, the following year, the year after the inaugural lecture, Barthes invoked a new logic which permits one, in any case permitted Proust, to abolish the contradiction between novel and essay. So he was giving himself permission to speak about himself. Hence, he says, I shall be speaking of myself, and he puts it in scare quotes. And then he added, it is the intimate which seeks utterance in me, seeks to make its cry heard, confronting generality, confronting science. That's the realm, to paraphrase the inaugural lecture again, of the unfixed, the historic, the corporeal, in short, of what I've been calling unlearning, though he doesn't, as I say, he doesn't really elaborate this idea as such in his final years. Unlearning is the process by which, in his books and his lectures, both of which were essayistic in form, I think, but resisted the generality, the systematicity of science. Learning, for Barthes' readers and auditors, was not a matter of absorbing information, but of attending to the intimate that sought utterance in him. So when we're dismissed from our academic posts, we're forced into premature retirement because of the hostile climate for the humanities, let's hope, and I'll end with this, that our students pay tribute to us by echoing the testament of Michelet's students. We learnt nothing from your lectures. It is simply that our soul, absent, came back to us. That, if you'll excuse the paradox, is an epitaph I can live with.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that, in a way, you are connecting us back to the very heart of what makes reading, studying, talking about literature, thinking together meaningful to us. And of course, all those sort of fascinating wanders into etymology, into thinking about the essay form as a constant becoming. To me, it raised many different questions. I will not get into them because I think people already have more questions. But I did think that, you, by the end of your talk, you brought us back to what it means for us to be teachers, and I think for many people to be students. And along with the kind of, outside market forces and what the institution wants us to produce, that also makes itself known in the kind of writing that we are meant to be teaching. I mean, almost the opposite of the essay would be the argument at some level, because the essay is meant to be where we loiter at, in trivia, to use your own etymologically informed, to echo that usage. An argument is focused. It is pointing towards it's a particular culmination. It seems to be that which makes you forget you have a soul, in that sense. So is that I have a personal question, which is that in your own classroom, do you find yourself encouraging people to dismantle argumentation? I mean, I'm also thinking about late Barthes and who's in Camera Lucida, it's somewhat essayistic, but in, say, Lover's Discourse, or in the even more posthumously published Morning Diary, we're dealing with fragments, with empty pages sometimes, and so it's almost as though he goes away into something even less coherent or fixed than the essay itself. So just, reflections. I was wondering if you could respond.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, certainly I don't have the self-confidence or the cultural capital to speak as Barthes might have spoken to students in my own student seminars. And of course, one does require an enormous amount of cultural capital to to be able to engage in acts of unlearning, as it were, and I don't doubt that. And certain types of people, consequently, are sort of privileged vectors, if you like, of unlearning. Not everyone can afford to sponsor unlearning, as Barth. I mean, Barth, in some ways, was an outsider, felt himself an outsider, not least because he was gay, but also because he'd never had an academic post. But even so, he had an enormous amount of symbolic capital. So yes, I don't really feel that I have the requisite self-competence or capital to engage in a series of digressions, one after the other, in the seminars I teach. And anyway, the students, not least because of the way in which they have been reconstructed, repositioned as consumers, are precisely desperate for an argument, for something they can take away, for something that they can use. It is very much the language of utility in exams. It's very much focused on exams. So, yeah, I think it becomes harder and harder to do this kind of thing that, in a rather utopian gesture, I've pointed to. On the other hand, students, it seems to me, but there are students in the room, so perhaps that they can testify, are interested in and are animated by teachers who operate within the realm, to use a distinction of Barth's, of the punctum rather than the studium. So in Camera Lucida, that last book of his, he draws a distinction in writing about photography, or writing about photographs, between the studium, which is very roughly the sort of field of meanings. Someone might want to correct me here if I'm being too imprecise, but the sort of field of meanings that are generated by an image, photographic image, which one can study in sort of scientific or pseudoscientific ways, and the punctum, the point, the little mark that reaches out to you from the photograph and appeals to you in your subjectivity, but calls it a wound. And he basically says, I'm not interested in the studium. I'm not interested in the field of meanings and the kind of conventions that prevail. What I want is to identify is that thing that calls out to me. Again, to requote a phrase that I've already used, it's the intimate crying out, trying to give utterance to itself. And I think students appreciate it when teachers appeal to the punctum as well as to the studium, however much they might be under pressure to feel in command as a result of a seminar or lecture of the studium, the field of meanings. But what really excites them is when a teacher lapses for a moment into the personal, risks a subjective judgment, and possibly even, as in the case of Michelle's talk earlier, admits to a kind of failure in the face of a Kafka novel, for example, a failure to say anything that's adequate. Sorry, that's a very circumlocutory response to the question.
As it should. We have questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this talk. You really spoke from my soul, which just means that you allowed me to believe that I could have said those things had I only spent the time, which of course I couldn't have. So thank you for that. I wondered about the concept of unlearning, which very much speaks to me. I take it that unlearning requires learning. That is, it's not the same as ignorance. It's a further step. And in Barth's own sequence, it comes late. It comes after research, right? I don't remember what the first step was.
It's...
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, teaching.
Anyway, it's the third thing. So I wondered if unlearning is something that you come to, and can only come to late in life, after you've actually been deformed in multiple ways by learning. I ask this question because there are so many students also in the room, right? So how does unlearning come about? I mean, you can't start there. You have to, in a way, earn unlearning. So it's a, since I'm interested in it also for pedagogical reasons, like how does one do this? It's a kind of Nietzschean project where the students have to, in a way, figure it out themselves. It's not something you can teach, right? They have to work against you. And I just wonder how you think about this. Is this a late life thing that we, if lucky, arrive at?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think you're right to think of it in sequential terms and to underline the fact that it's not ignorance, it's not folly, that it's a sort of third dialectical term and a third dialectical stage after ignorance and knowledge, or unknowing and learning. So perhaps it is associated with a certain maturity, and that maturity is indissociable, I suspect, from the kind of symbolic and cultural capital that I was talking about being necessary to sort of pull off unlearning in a pedagogical context. I'm really interested, not that I dwelt on it at all, but your really interesting comments made me think about it again. Bart's emphasis on forgetting, and yeah, it seems to me that there's something very hopeful about his emphasis on forgetting, both because it honestly confronts something about which we're often very embarrassed, which is our ability to forget things. I mean, I don't have a good memory. I often forget things, and he seems to sort of, he valorizes forgetting in the same way, for example, that someone like Stanley Cavell does in his writings about film, where he says, when we talk about and write about films, we shouldn't be talking about the film. We should be talking about we're talking about our memory. We should openly be talking about our memory of the film, which is something quite different from the film. It's like, it's the film work, like the dream work, like the Freudian dream work. It's a film that's got reorganized in our head. It's okay to talk about the film that's got reorganized in our head. All of us have different versions of the same film. We might be talking to some extent at cross purposes. Forgetting here in Barth is something like that. It seems to me that he's making it a really positive thing. For a future in which we all live to 110 and have dementia, it seems to me immensely hopeful, this message, that we can kind of go on imparting learning because we're imparting unlearning at the same time, because forgetting is part of that economy of learning.
Hi, Matthew. What a wonderful talk. Thank you. I just want to bring in a few more histories into this. I think they haven't been talked about very much in this discussion of the writer-critic. Not yours, but through the last 2 days. But I also, I was thinking about how essays might, at some point, maybe 2,000 years from now, become sacred texts. With Barth, with some of his essays, Death of the Author, that happened very quickly, and so people stopped reading it. Basically, they could paraphrase it; they thought they knew it. Actually, it's a work of fiction almost, It happened with the Gita, which is one of the first texts that I know, which says nothing. You learn nothing from it. I realized that when rereading it to write an introduction to it, that at least from the Mahabharata, in which it is embedded, I get to know a story. But I finished the Gita, I felt changed by it, but I realized that being changed had actually nothing to do with having learned anything from it after I'd begun it. So, and which is true, besides it being true of the essay, being true of the poem, which is why you can start reading it almost immediately after you finish it. It has no narrative loss, which novels and stories do. You finished it, You don't have to, you don't want to start reading it again at once. With a poem, you've actually learned nothing. But something has happened. What has happened hasn't depleted what we call, knowledge, hasn't added to it. You start reading it again. The Gita is one such text. That leads me to these other histories. Because you mentioned savoring, I'm sure Shumana would have had something to say. She teaches a course on rasa. It kind of comes up as a term very early on. That early on is maybe late in the day when Bharat writes about it. But rasa, juice, the taste of aesthetic emotion. He identifies 8. He calls our kind of interaction with those rasas in theater a swad, tasting, savoring. Different again from the aristocratic taste that you're talking about, and much more akin to what you're talking about, which I think emerges from a similar cultural lineage being recuperated. I mean, Barth was interested, to put it mildly, in Japan. But even before that, I mean, there's a whole set of changes taking place, including the term coming up with Clive Bell, and then aesthetic emotion, and then with Eliot, significant emotion. Aesthetic emotion seems to me like a translation of Ras, and they are in contact with this man called Anand Kumar Swami, who was spreading the word in the early 20th century about Ras. An important moment in the 10th century to connecting savoring to unlearning or unknowing is Abhinavagupta, referring to another critic a century before him, Bhattanayak, of whom almost nothing survives except what we know through Abhinavagupta. Abhinavagupta adds a 9th ras, a 9th taste, which is shant, peace. You know the word from the end of the wasteland, shant. Eliot finds it very difficult to translate, right? He falls back on the Bible, I think. Peace that passeth understanding. It's unlearning, it's unknowing,
The third emotion between the acts.
Right. Right. So shant is added in the 10th century, and it says, so shant ras is a 9th ras, but it's also there in all the rasas, which is why, you kind of partake of the terrifying ras or the disgusting ras or the happy ras or the sad ras, but you are not terrified or you are not disgusted. And the shant ras makes possible this access to ananda, joy or bliss. Yesterday, Rosinka brought up, and then Rita did, the word maja, fun or delight. And Rita contrasted it with ananda, but ananda is also maja. Shant, this state of unknowing, which we translate as peace sometimes, allows that delight to happen and to be tasted. I mean, that's the main thing. So I just wanted to bring that in. I think Barth is there somewhere in the middle of all this, as is Montaigne. I cannot imagine that he is disconnected from what's happening in the 16th, 17th centuries in terms of Buddhist ideas of the self and the unreliability of the self coming into Europe with Jesuits, bringing that kind of stuff into Europe. So I think those things are connected. I don't want that other history to be consigned to the Orient. They didn't consign it to the Orient. I'm talking about Eric Gill, Clive Bell, all the rest of them. We need to bring it back over here into this discussion.
No, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I've got nothing to add. That was absolutely fascinating.
Small moment.
We're actually out of time. There's a
One small moment.
sure.